Her face went pale. She tried to say something, but I stopped her. I didn't need to hear excuses. I didn't need to hear words that couldn't erase what I knew. You ruined everything we had, I continued, and I can't just ignore that. She was silent. Regret glittered in her eyes again, but it couldn't bring back everything that had been lost. I could feel pity, but she was in no position to bring back what had been destroyed. We had no future because she had destroyed it. And I wasn't about to let myself be blind again. I turned and walked to the other room. I needed to get away. I needed to get rid of this pain. With every step I took, I realized that this wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the end of the life I knew and the beginning of a new one in which I would have to learn to live with betrayal. Upon reflection, I remembered how she and I had built our dreams, how I believed that everything we did mattered. But now I realized that the love I thought was real turned out to be an illusion. And the real reality was pain and loneliness. I stood in silence, feeling every part of my body begging for a break, but I couldn't stop. Inhale, exhale, I needed to keep going, I needed to find a way out of this nightmarish reality. I didn't know what to do with this pain, how to live with it, how to keep going when the world was collapsing right in front of my eyes. I felt completely isolated from everything that used to matter. The house that she and I had built was now empty. All the memories, all the moments I held dear, now seemed painfully false. Every word I had once spoken to her, every promise we had built, now sounded like a farce. It was all shattered in an instant, and I couldn't believe it was really happening. She sat on the couch, silent, her face pale, and though I realized she was probably worried, I couldn't forgive her. Whatever she was feeling, I couldn't believe in her anymore. She was a stranger to me. It felt as if we had become two completely different people, and I didn't know who she was now. How could you? I still said the words, not expecting myself to say that. But they sounded like a sincere question, like an attempt to find some explanation in her words. I needed to know why she did it, what made her change. But, of course, there was no answer. All I could see in her eyes was a kind of blank stare, full of regret, but that wasn't enough. She tried to speak, but I interrupted her. It was no use. I was too upset to listen to excuses, explanations I didn't need at all. Inside, I knew none of it mattered. She couldn't earn back my trust. She couldn't fix what she'd ruined. I can't just forget about it, I said, and the words sounded cold, but to me it was the truth. You destroyed our family, you destroyed everything we were building. You don't deserve forgiveness. Her eyes filled with tears, but it didn't move me. I knew her regret wouldn't bring back what was lost. She sat there, lips pressed together, unable to say anything. I watched her, trying to understand what had happened. How could she change her life like that? Why didn't she stop in time? Why wasn't she thinking about us? But thinking about it only added to my despair. I needed to leave. I needed to leave this place to regain some of my strength. I couldn't stay here. I turned around and headed for the door, but before I walked out, I looked back and said, I don't know what's next, but I do know that I can't be with you. I walked out without looking back. With every step I took, I tried to find the strength within myself to let it all go. I could feel myself breaking. But if I stayed, if I kept fighting, it wouldn't be because of love. It would have been because of fear, fear of being alone, fear of losing everything that seemed important. And that was my biggest mistake, the realization of which came later. Outside, I stood watching the darkness of night engulf the city. Everything was the same as before, but now I felt like a stranger in this world. This whole world, my habits, my memories, everything had changed, and it was so painful that I didn't know where to begin. I felt lost, like a person who had just come out of a fog and realized his life wasn't what it used to be. I didn't know how much time I spent outside trying to sort out my feelings. I didn't know where to go, what to do. Everything was shattered, and a new life opened up in front of me, a life in which I had to learn to be alone, to learn how to overcome this pain. But I didn't know how to do it yet. Every step seemed so difficult, every memory so painful. And yet, I knew I had to move forward. My mind wandered, and I tried to figure out how to come to an understanding of what had happened. But still I couldn't find an answer. It was empty, cold, and every step in this new world seemed harder and harder. I stood outside, trying to put my thoughts in order, but they were slipping away from me like sand you can't grab with your hand. My body felt tired, but it wasn't so much physical exhaustion as psychological. Emotions raged inside me like a hurricane: anger, betrayal, frustration. These feelings were burning me from the inside out, and I didn't know how to deal with this chaos. I felt like every cell in my body was protesting what had happened. It wasn't clear to me why she had done this. All I knew was that our world was destroyed. I still remembered that moment when I walked into the conference room holding a bouquet of flowers and saw her face, full of joy and confidence, as if nothing had happened. What was I thinking? That she was waiting for me? That she genuinely loved me? I tried to explain to myself that everything was normal, that the love was strong. But what had happened? I took a few steps down the deserted streets, trying to shake off the growing feeling of emptiness. I wanted to just scream, but I couldn't. The words wouldn't come out of my mouth. Anger and pain were burning me from the inside out, but I didn't want to turn into something that would only ruin everything around me. I didn't want her to become the person I hated, but maybe I couldn't believe her anymore. All I had to do was face what had happened. Why? Was the word spinning around in my head like a broken record? Why didn't she stop? Why didn't she come and tell me the truth? Why am I still standing in this cold, not knowing what to do? Why did she betray me with him? What happened to us in the first place? My hands were shaking, and I clutched them to my chest. I could feel my heart beating faster, the blood pulsing in my temples. I wanted to find answers, but there were only questions in my mind, leaving me with no peace. Staying here, in this pain, was impossible, but leaving was even harder. Not knowing what to do, I stopped, looking at the buildings that seemed to have no meaning to me. The world continued to spin, but my world had already shattered. I walked back home, step by step. And scraps of phrases sounded in my head: you loved her. You believed in her. Why didn't she believe in you? But those thoughts were quickly replaced by memories of our time together. How we laughed, how her eyes lit up when she talked about the future. It seemed so distant, so foreign now. I didn't know what to do with this ache. My body was filled with emotion, but I couldn't spill it out. Talk to her. But what good would that do? How could I look at her now and trust that she hadn't betrayed me again? She'd destroyed everything we'd built. And now I had to learn to live with that. I had no options. All I could do was deal with what had happened and try to move on. As I approached the house, I stopped in front of the door. I held my breath. This place, this space that had once been home, now seemed alien. Everything, every corner reminded me of what had happened. And I didn't know how to come back to life. I probably wasn't ready for it, but I couldn't back down. There were memories behind the door, there were years I may have lost. When I opened the door, there wasn't a single thought in my head. Everything looked just as I had left it, empty, cold and lifeless. This was not my place. Not my home. I closed my eyes, trying not to think about what was happening now. But she was there. I knew she was waiting for me. And no matter how hard I tried to cope, I needed to find a solution. She sat in the living room, calm, with eyes full of regret. I didn't need her excuse, I didn't need to hear her sorry. I needed to figure out what to do about it, how to live with this betrayal. But how? The words I thought to say didn't reach my lips. There was too much pain. Too much hurt. She started to say she was a mistake, that it didn't matter, that she was sorry. But those words sounded like nothing. It was nothing compared to what I was feeling. Is she really sorry? Or was she just afraid of losing everything she had? I closed my eyes and turned and walked to my room. The pain wouldn't let go. Every memory, every word we once spoke to each other now seemed foreign. I didn't know how to deal with it. But I had to find a way. I couldn't just stay in this state, not knowing what to do. Once I was in my room, the door closed quietly behind me and it was as if the world had collapsed on me. I sat down on my bed, but the feeling of heaviness never left me. It wasn't like a normal feeling of sadness. It was a real tearing, as if I had been ripped out of my life, thrown into the void. Every corner of my mind was screaming, demanding an answer. Why her? Why had she chosen him? Why was I left with this loneliness? I could almost physically feel that question, like it was an arrow lodged in my chest. I tried to remember the moments when she looked at me lovingly, when we laughed together, when we made plans for the future. It all seemed so distant and meaningless. Wasn't she a part of it all? Hadn't she told me that I was her rock, that she couldn't live without me? My face burned with restrained anger. How could I have been so blind? Memories replayed in my head, her long nights at work. Her strange excuses when I tried to make time for us. She seemed to say that it was okay, that everything would be fine, but now I knew it was a lie. How had I not seen this before? Why hadn't I caught up with her sooner? Why hadn't I asked what was going on when she had become such a stranger? At first, I tried to keep my cool. But the more I thought about it, the stronger that inner fire became. Every day I felt more and more that she had just walked away from me, not physically, but spiritually. It wasn't just cheating. It was a betrayal of her whole soul, of her promises. Everything we had built was now shattered in an instant. Her smile when I walked in with the flowers was like a knife in the back. Was I really that naive? She knew I loved her. But she did it anyway. I couldn't stop asking myself, why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you tell me? Why did you keep it all to yourself? That was the moment I realized that she no longer valued me. She no longer saw me as the person she'd built a life with. I was just a convenient option to use until someone came along to fulfill her desires. I got up and went to the window, staring out into the darkness of the night city. Cars drove by, light seeped into the windows of the houses. It seemed like an ordinary world, an ordinary life, but everything was different for me. I didn't know what to do, but I needed to act. Not for revenge, but to get my life back. I had to figure out how to move on, how to rebuild everything I'd lost. But how? What to do now with what I'd been through? With these thoughts I went to bed, but sleep didn't come. Everything was mixing in my head, love, hate, pain. I couldn't get her out of my head, couldn't get rid of the image of her face, her fake smile, her infidelity. As morning came, when I woke up, the feeling of emptiness became even more vivid. I realized that I couldn't just sit back and let life flow past me. I had to do something about it. Not to get revenge, but to regain control of my life. I couldn't let her destroy everything that was important to me. She had already chosen her path. But my path hadn't been decided yet. My thoughts were like a whirlwind. I could feel my inner world shrinking, but at the same time I couldn't let it consume me. I couldn't let this betrayal become the thing that would define me. I had to find a way to rise up, even if everything around me was crumbling. I knew I wouldn't be able to forgive her right away, and that I might never be able to regain the trust one had in her. But I had to move on. I had to figure myself out, figure out what I needed in this life. And maybe find some answers to the questions that were bothering me. I went outside, took a breath of fresh air. The world around me hadn't changed. But I was no longer the person who could get through all of this without consequences. I was different now, a man who had seen his life destroyed and had to live with it. My steps were tentative, but determined. At this point, I realized that I needed time to think things through. But most importantly, I needed to realize that this wasn't the end. And that perhaps this was the moment my road to recovery would begin. A continuation was needed so that I could continue to build on the events and deepen them. My inner world continued to remain in turmoil, but step by step I was beginning to realize that despite all the pain and frustration, I needed to move forward. My life continued to go on, but it didn't seem the same anymore. Every morning I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest. Everything that had seemed important before was now meaningless. Thoughts of the past haunted me. Scenes kept flashing through my mind, moments when I believed everything would be okay. When she and I seemed to be in the same world. But that world collapsed in an instant, like a house of cards that collapses at the slightest whiff. I started avoiding her gaze, didn't know what to say. Every time I saw her, she seemed to look at me like a stranger. It was agonizing. I tried to find answers, but it seemed the more I pondered, the farther away those answers became. Life in our home became more and more stressful. I began to notice that she began to avoid talking about the future, that she was disappearing more and more often, withdrawing into her thoughts. These moments became my test. And it was hard for me to understand why I hadn't noticed until then that things had gone wrong so long ago. However, I realized that I had to act now. I couldn't stay in this quagmire. I couldn't let this destruction define who I was. But where do I go from here? How do I keep going? I could feel it all starting to depress me. I couldn't run away from it. I needed to realize that this wasn't the end, that there was a chance to start something new, but in order to do that I had to be completely free of it. I've often reflected on our past. How we met, how we built our little world. I remembered the moments when I believed in us, when I was proud to have her, my wife, by my side. I remembered how we made plans, how we talked about children, about what our life would be like in 10 years. They were such bright memories, but now they seemed so distant and fragile. I sat in silence, in our living room, and thought about how things might have been if she hadn't chosen this path. I couldn't get rid of the image of her smile, the very fake smile she gave me in that moment. It was like a betrayal, like a deception. She knew that I believed in her, that I trusted her. But now I saw that she had chosen a different road. And that road was leading me to pain and disappointment. I decided it was time to talk to her. I didn't know what to say, how to express my pain, but I knew it had to be done. We had to talk despite all of our differences and the distance that had developed between us. I felt that this conversation could be the last step towards understanding, towards ending this chapter of our lives. I looked at her sitting across from me, her gaze was cold and detached. She looked like there was nothing important between us. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words stuck in my throat. She was so distant. There wasn't that sincerity, that light that used to be there. With every word she spoke, I could feel the alienation growing between us. Do you love him? I couldn't contain the question. It was a question I couldn't hold in any longer. I had to know. Her eyes darkened for a moment, and she didn't answer right away. She seemed about to say something, but then fell silent. That silence was the hardest punishment of all. It was worse than any word. I waited and she just sat there, unable to answer. That moment when she couldn't even say no, when she couldn't even justify her betrayal, was the end. It was the moment I realized that everything I knew about our life was gone forever. I felt something inside me break. It wasn't just resentment. It was a break not only in our marriage, but in my very idea of what it means to love and be loved. I searched for answers, but there were none. All I wanted was to take back the days when things were good, when we were happy, but the reality wasn't like that. The reality was that she had chosen this path and I had to accept it. I was no longer the person I used to be. I had changed. And perhaps that process of change was just beginning. That night, I finally made a decision. I couldn't go on living in this swamp. Not to seek revenge, but to find a path that would take me to new heights. I didn't know what that would look like, but I knew one thing: I needed to move forward. And perhaps this step was the first step in the direction of a new life. With that decision, I went to bed, but sleep didn't come. I knew I had a long road ahead of me, full of pain, questions, and possibly disappointment. But I was ready. I woke up the next morning with a heavy feeling in my chest. It felt like all the pain of the past days had gathered in one huge lump, squeezing my lungs. I didn't know how to start the day, what to do, how to move forward. But I felt I had to do something drastic. There was no point in resting and waiting. I was already tired of this inaction, of not knowing where to go. My heart was filled with contradictions. I still loved her, but at the same time I felt so much hatred that I couldn't admit it to myself. Looking in the mirror reflected a person I no longer knew. At times I could feel how broken I was, how I had lost a part of myself, but the other part wouldn't let me give up. I had to make a change. I couldn't be the one passively watching his life fall apart. I thought again about what had happened. Remembering all the moments that seemed so important and now seemed empty. She and I walked together for a long time, making plans, believing in the future. My whole life was dedicated to this woman. I believed that with her I had everything. I could have left, but I couldn't. I couldn't just pick up and leave everything that was connected to her. I was still searching for answers, but each new step only confused me more. She had made her choice, but I needed to realize that I needed to move forward. To be strong in spite of everything, I decided I needed to talk to her. No aggression, no yelling, no accusations. But the moment I walked to the door of her office, I could feel how hard it was for me to take that step. The sky seemed darkened and the air around me thick, as if I didn't belong here. I held my breath and knocked. She was sitting at the table, her eyes tired, but she still smiled when she saw me. "Did you come to talk?" Her voice was soft as always, but there was a kind of aloofness in it that couldn't help but irritate. She didn't seem to realize the gravity of what was happening. It was as if everything we'd been through had turned out to be so insignificant. "Yeah, we need to talk," I said, trying to stay calm. I knew that if I started talking about my feelings now, it would hurt too much, but I didn't tell her that. I knew I couldn't stay quiet any longer. "What do you want to tell me?" Her question was calm, almost indifferent. It truly shocked me. I expected to hear some alarm, some remorse. But her eyes were cold, and there was no remorse or regret in her voice. "You cheated on me. You did it with him. With your coworker. And I can't understand why." "I need to understand it because it's very important to me," I spoke, trying not to give away my emotions. Every word felt like a knife, but I said them anyway, because it was probably the only way to make sense of myself. She was quiet for a moment, and then her face became more tense. I felt like she was ready to say something, but then she just shook her head and said, "You won't understand this. You won't understand why I did it." I fell silent. My heart clenched. I didn't know what to say. But I knew I couldn't stay in this house, in this life, if she didn't tell me what happened. If she didn't make it clear what she'd done and why. I didn't need forgiveness. I just needed to understand what was behind it all. My life and our relationship couldn't stay the way it was before. I was ready to end this phase, but only if I got an answer. "Why? Just tell me. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking you to come back. I just want to understand how this could have happened." She stood up from the table and her eyes became moist, but not for the reason I expected. She was looking at me strangely, as if studying me. There wasn't so much regret in her eyes as despair. It was then that I realized that none of this was such an easy choice for her. I don't know how to explain. "You've become too familiar to me. You've become part of this world, part of your success." But her voice trembled. I could see her words coming out with difficulty. I needed something else, something fresh, something that could bring back my feelings. He became that. My heart clenched and the thought flashed through my mind of how it could be. We'd both been part of this machine so long ago that we'd lost the spark that had once connected us. She began to look for it in another person, and I never noticed it. Maybe it was my own flaw. I was wrong, I know. Her voice became quiet, almost inaudible. But I couldn't go back. And you probably realize that. My hands began to shake. I knew that everything she was saying was an attempt to justify what had happened, and I didn't know what to do about it. It was like a shadow hung in the air, and I stood in front of her, not knowing what to do. The silence dragged on and everything seemed so unreal. I continued to stand in front of her, and she, in turn, couldn't meet my gaze. All I knew was that there was no going back. I heard the truth in her words, but that truth was no comfort to me. She was searching for something outside of us, something I couldn't give her, though I tried. I thought about how happy we'd once been, how we'd made plans together, how we'd dreamed of a future full of light and hope. And now everything was ruined. I felt something inside me break. All those years, lost. Every night together, every smile, every word now seemed empty. And even though I felt angry, bitter, and hurt, I couldn't help but feel her fear as well. It wasn't just my blow, but hers as well. She had lost something important herself, and it was probably even harder for her than it was for me. I've tried to understand, but I'm having a hard time, I said, slowly sitting down in the chair across from her. I felt a growing ache in my chest, a lump rising in my throat. I didn't know what to think, how to react, but it was impossible to stay silent. She sat across from me, head down. And said nothing. Her silence was worse than any words. It seemed that her whole inner world had collapsed, and now she just couldn't say anything, couldn't explain. It was that moment when she might have already realized everything, but the words couldn't come back. I'm not apologizing, I continued, my voice getting firmer. But I need to understand what happened, why it happened, to decide what happens next. I can't live with this if I don't get answers. Her eyes rose, but there wasn't the expression I wanted to see in them. There was no regret, no remorse, just coldness and weariness. I don't know how to explain it, but I tried to live with it, to live like I used to. But something was changing inside me, and I couldn't control it. Her words sounded sincere, but I realized that couldn't be an excuse. I realized then that everything I knew and what I thought was mine was now a stranger. She was a stranger to me, and I to her. We were both looking for something we couldn't find in our marriage. How could you leave us so easily? Abandon me, our family? My voice began to shake, and I felt tears rolling down my cheeks. I didn't want to hold them back because I realized, I needed to get over this. I need to spill this out, to be free of all this pain. You don't think I'm in pain? Her voice was full of fear, and I saw her eyes fill with tears. You think I don't realize what I've lost? I lost my family, I lost you. And I'm in pain. But I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't. In that moment, it became clear to me that despite her words, she couldn't forgive herself. She couldn't accept what she had done. But she had chosen to do it anyway, and I couldn't take that back. We sat in silence, and I thought about how to go on living with this knowledge. Maybe I could forgive her, but right now I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know if I could ever go back to my old life. Do you want me to stay? I asked suddenly, even though I knew the answer probably wouldn't be comforting. She sighed, her shoulders slumped, and she said quietly, I don't know. I can't tell you what's going to happen next. I need time to realize what I've done. I realized I couldn't go on living with this man, this woman who had changed everything we had. My soul was shattered, and I didn't know if I could ever rebuild myself. My footsteps led me out of her office, and I no longer felt the confidence I once had in me. I was leaving this house, this life, and I didn't know what I was going to do next. But one thing was clear, I couldn't stay in this lie. I walked outside, and the cold wind blew against me, as if reminding me that everything had already changed. There were many thoughts in my head, but they all boiled down to one thing, the vast chasm that had opened up between me and the woman I had once built my life with. I couldn't understand how things could have fallen apart so quickly. How could a love that seemed so strong become so fragile? How could I be betrayed, deceived, and go on with my life as if nothing had happened? I felt anger overwhelm me, mixed with a pang of bitterness. I remembered our first day together. How she'd laughed when I'd brought her flowers, how she'd said she wanted nothing more than my love. We had planned a future, dreamed of children, of a house where we would grow old together. Where are those dreams now? Where is the love that once burned bright? It was consumed by something else. Something that had nothing to do with us. I got in my car and drove to my friend's house. I needed to talk, to find some comfort. I didn't know what to say, what to think, but I needed to share the pain. When I arrived, I noticed that my friends were already waiting for me. They knew something was wrong and they could see in my eyes that I was going through something huge. "Are you okay?" My friend Dan asked when I walked in. I shook my head, unable to answer. There was too much on my shoulders. I knew I needed to get over it, but I didn't know how. "She cheated on me," I finally squeezed out. "With a coworker of mine. Someone I've worked with for so many years." Dan sat silent, realizing this was a hard blow. All my feelings were jumbled together, and I didn't know how to express what was going on inside. I felt like she had ruined me, but even more so that she had ruined everything I thought was important. Not just a relationship, but trust, a future, hopes. "Are you going to forgive her?" Dan asked, watching me carefully. I didn't know what to answer. Everything was jumbling in my head and I couldn't find an answer. I knew she had hurt me, but I felt even more strongly that I had become a stranger to her myself. We were no longer the people we used to be. "I don't know," I answered, feeling the pain clench in my chest again. "But I can't just let it go. She changed everything. I can't turn a blind eye to it. I can't just carry on as if nothing happened." Dan probably understood me better than anyone. He didn't try to comfort me, didn't tell me things would get better. He just sat next to me, sharing my pain. "Do what you think is right," he finally said. "But remember, you need to make a decision that you can live with." They were simple words, but they hurt me. I realized that I needed to make a choice. And no matter what it was, it had to be a decision that I would carry for the rest of my life. As I drove home that evening, I thought about how I needed to move forward. Maybe this is all just part of something bigger. Maybe this experience was supposed to teach me something important. I didn't know how it would end, but I knew one thing: I couldn't go back to the life I had before. Life with her betrayal didn't make sense to me. That night, I made a decision. I didn't know what I was going to do with our marriage, with our relationship, but I knew for sure that I could no longer continue to live a lie. I wasn't going to wait for her to make the decision for me. I had to take responsibility for my life. And that meant I had to move on. All I could do at that moment was to try to find myself again. To get in touch with myself, to figure out what I really wanted, and how I was going to live in this world that was now foreign and alien. But one thing was clear: this experience had left a mark that I couldn't just erase. I remember lying in bed at night, trying to sleep. Her words were still echoing in my head. I couldn't understand how love could change so much, how trust could be shattered in an instant. But I knew one thing: I was ready to move on. As painful as it was, I knew my life wasn't over. The story of this love, this marriage, was a former phase, and I had to find a path to my future, albeit with a heavy heart. All I had to do was move forward, one step at a time, and hope that someday I could let go of this pain.